I want to compare these two problems that are very similar but actually very different. This first one asks you to solve sine x equals negative a half, and it has infinitely many solutions. So, for instance, if we think about the sine function, we know it looks like this. And if we look at when is sine equal to negative a half, that's going to be down here. And there's going to be many, many, many solutions. Infinitely many, in fact. And so how do you find all the solutions? Well, basically we have to find the solutions in one cycle and then add 2n pi. So because it is negative, we would expect that to be in quadrants. Which quadrants? For a negative. For a negative sign, remember if we do our little ASTC, that's the cheaty way to do it. Sine will be negative in these two quadrants. And because the reference angle, because sine x equals a half, when x is pi over 6 is when sine x is a half, we want the reference angles of pi over 6 in here. And so that means we need this one, and that's 6 pi over 6 plus a pi over 6. So that gives us 7 pi over 6. And then we need this one all the way around here would be, well, this would be 12 pi over 6. So if we go back a notch, it would be 11 pi over 6. And then we need all of the solutions in the entire world, so we're going to add 2n pi, because that adds the period, and that will give us the repeats out here. So how is that different than this problem? Problem 2 over here asks you just evaluate arcsine of negative a half. So it's really asking you two questions. It's saying sine of what equals negative a half, but also because it's asking for the arcsine, and arcsine is defined in a very particular way as a one-to-one function. There is only one solution to this problem. And so what we need to do is sine of what equals negative a half, but the what, the angle, must be between pi over 2 and negative pi over 2. Why? Because that is the way we defined it. Arcsine is defined as having input value between negative 1 and 1, and an output value between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. So we are looking now between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. And so since it's negative, since we're trying to find when is the sign negative a half, we definitely want this quadrant. And the answer will be negative pi over 6. So the question mark, which is the angle, will be negative pi over 6. No plus 2n pi. This is it. It has exactly one answer, because the arcsine function is one-to-one. That's the only way that it can have inverse, that the sine can have an inverse, is if you're one-to-one. So we have restricted that domain, so it has to be just this one answer. Notice that it has to be negative pi over 6. So writing 11 pi over 6 over here would be wrong. It's just wrong, because arcsine is defined, it has a range of between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. So negative pi over 6 is the only correct answer for that. Whereas over here in this green problem on number 1, you wouldn't necessarily have to define them this way. It is pretty standard to define them as between 0 and 2 pi, and use these. But you could, instead of saying 11 pi over 6, you could say negative pi over 6 plus 2n pi, and that would be an okay answer as well. But it is pretty standard to have these between 0 and 2 pi in the first period of the function. So I hope that helps you see the difference between solving an equation and evaluating an arc trig function.